In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, good morning to you all. So, museums is one of the most important cultural institutions that contribute to sustainable development, and this is one of the bases whereby we preserve national identities because it is linked to civilization and culture, and it also motivates positive interaction and contributes to economic cultural development. We would like to discuss today the museums in the Gulf countries and identity building. So, this is going to be the title of our session, and we're going to have three professors taking the floor. Sorry, we're going to have Dr. Sundus Al-Rashid, Dr. Alanoud, Abdullah Al-Khalifa, and Dr. Hai Wan Jeong. We're going to give the floor now to Sundus Al-Rashid. She is the head of the National Committee for Museums. She has a PhD from London and a master's about contemporary culture, exhibitions, and museums, and she is a member of the National Organization for Museums. So she concentrates on the role of museums in forming communities, particularly in the GCC. She's going to concentrate on the GCC museums and would like to give her the floor. Her paper is going to be entitled under the title of Museums in the Arab Gulf States, Cultural Symbols or Political Forces. The name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. So we have a presentation. So we would like to try to break the ice and we're going to start our presentation as soon as we get the presentation on the screen. So, are these cultural symbols or political forces? When we talk about museums, so many ask questions what has politics to do with museums, particularly in the GCC? So, our national museums, if we talk about these particular museums, these are places that try to recount the national story and also heritage. So, what has politics to do with museums? So, when we talk about museums and when they were established in order to recount this story, in order to reinforce national identities, but is there a political message? Yes, this is necessary to have a political message, so there are political dimensions. So, when we talk about politics and museums, we would like to talk about the history of museums since they were established, how they were established, and what is their relationship with the museum. So, these museums are kind of boxes, if we may call them, and they have stories behind them. So there have been a number of museums that were dedicated to the elite. So they used to be called like boxes of curiosity. And after those boxes or those museums started to open up for the public, they were having, I mean, only certain particular times where people would be able to visit those museums. So in the 18th century, we have seen the beginning of revolutions in Europe. So, with the start of those revolutions, we have seen a change in terms of knowledge, and also there has been a social change as well. And the discourse has changed and has become much more open compared to previous times. And after that, the museum started to have a kind of a public dimension, trying to support and underline the issues of the community. So this is a kind of a historical background of museums, their works and their practices. And here we would like to pose the question, are museums a Western idea or thought? Many think that this was the origin of museums, and that the patent of museums lies in the hands of the West. And the ideas adopted when it comes to museums is not going to be particular to that particular region that had adopted those ideas. So there have been so many ideas. So there is a political dimension that is part and parcel of museums. So as representative of the state that tries to delineate the culture of the community. So this culture is well studied. In recent years, we have started seeing that museums started tackling bold topics and also started tackling very sensitive issues such as cultural diversity, bondage, or slavery, or servitude, and also the museums were no longer a place where you're going to have a number of components or things that are displayed for people to watch and come to see. So the situation changed altogether. So we have a number of museums. So we can see this museum here, an exhibition about the culture of West Africa. And this is a statue that is in bronze and that tries to reflect the works and chores that were carried out by slaves during that period of time. If we look at the museum movement in the GCC, so this movement dates back to the mid 20th century. So I try to divide this movement into two phases. So we're talking about mid 20th century. This was the beginning. And then we are talking about the year 2000 till date. We're talking about the last 2 decades that represent the second phase of those museums. So the establishment of museums, which started in Kuwait in 1957. So the Kuwait Museum was the first museum in the GCC, even before Kuwait got its independence. So during that period of time, countries attempted to build museums in order to safeguard the heritage after the commercial and economic openness in the GCC and the cultural diversity that we started witnessing due to the advent of migrant workers. So those museums continued in such a format until the 70s. During the beginning of the 80s, we have seen that those projects have started expanding, and we have seen the interference of the West. We have seen the National Museum of Kuwait that was established in 1983. So we did consult with the UNESCO and also the International Council for Museums. So they came up with a complete conceptualization of this museum. The designer and the architect was of this museum was the same architect and designer of the Museum of Bahrain. So there is a kind of a process that is followed in the GCC when it comes to building those museums in different countries. So both museums in Kuwait and Bahrain, there is a similarity when it comes to architecture. So it seems as if the architect has a different or a same, sorry, view when it comes to these museums. So the second phase was a different phase where we have started seeing a transformation, a leap. And rebound in the way museums are being established. We have started seeing grand museums, partnerships taking place in the GCC. So designs were very interesting, and also the traits of those museums started changing. So we have started seeing criticism uh, about those museums in general, and also the content of those museums has started changing. We have the Future Museum in Kuwait. These are huge projects that are largely promoted there, and museums promote themselves as being educational and social kind of ecosystems. So these are ecosystems also that have a kind of a policy. This policy is implicit. So when we talk about this kind of symbolism and how it is impacted by the West during the development of museums in the GCC we have been going through a period which is the imperial phase, where we witnessed a power that was imposed on us, and also control of the trade routes. And after that, we entered into the post imperial period, the all colonial period. But this is the phase that we are still living up to now. And this entails how we're going to shine light on the cultural components in the aftermath of the colonial era. So, what we conclude from this research paper is that the museum movement was delineated in keeping with plans that were imposed by the West. So, there is a kind of a hegemony that is imposed by the West and on cultural activities in the GCC. So, we thought at the beginning that it was the West that had imposed such kind of ideas. So, they started afterwards controlling how those museums are established and what is being presented as content in those museums. So we took those policies, these practices, and we implemented them without taking into account or tailoring them to the particularity of our community. We are different from the West. We have our own culture. We have also our own traditions. These traditions differ from one country in the GCC to another, let alone when we compare it to the West. Also, there have been a number of research papers that have been developed and studies also, and most of those studies were developed and written by Western experts. Till date, we do not have academic experts specialized in this field because museum studies have not developed to the extent whereby we can see real experts working in these matters in the GCC. So we have some of the experts who are in their nursery slopes phase, but we have also some hegemony when it comes to the West, so we cannot talk about real expertise when it comes to that. So museums is representative of what is called the soft power in the GCC. So when we visit some museums in some of the GCC countries, so I say it very bluntly, I find that most museums are almost empty because those museums did not promote themselves as educational centers, as social centers, irrespective of any other kind of objectives. These museums do not present themselves as representative of a soft power. They do not promote themselves as a move towards modernity. Yes, Kuwait was the first country that has undertaken such a step, but we still find ourselves not in keeping with other countries, even in the GCC. Although we were the first that started with museums, we're still not in keeping with what was achieved by the rest of the countries in the GCC, such as Qatar and UAE. And we find that Saudi Arabia is also promoting itself, and we find as well Al-Ula city, which is also a city that is being promoted as a heritage city. So the people of the region, of those areas, are given scholarships. They go and they study museum studies, cultural studies, and heritage studies to come back to their own cities to promote their own culture. So our museums in the GCC are still being criticized, and up to now, irrespective of the development that had been achieved so far, these museums still consult with other entities. We still have the Western presence in our museums. We can say that we are facing a new kind of colonialism, which is under the umbrella of consultation or consultancies. So, up to now, even the experts we have, we do not trust them fully unless we have Western experts who can perhaps give us some advice when it comes to the discourse that should be followed. The language of discourse is still English. Some explanations or explications, when some of them are read, we find that they are very difficult to read because in essence these were written in a foreign language and had been translated into the Arabic language, and even the translation is not the translation that would reflect or would be understood by people who speak Arabic. So you can tell that this is a translated text, and sometimes the translation is not accurate enough. So the question that I posed at the beginning, and I would like to pose it once again at the end of my presentation: have the museums in the GCC, have they been able to achieve their objectives vis-a-vis the community? This is a very big question, and if we wish to answer this question very accurately, we have to look into each and every national museum in the GCC to see the objectives of the museum and also how much it was able to spread in the community. Perhaps museums have become a soft power that tries to promote museums in the West, but how are our museums in our community? Yes, they have been established in order to promote national identity. But is this the role that is undertaken by museums in our countries? And up to now, if I would like to mention, for instance, as an example, the Kuwaiti National Museum, it was not till date able to achieve its objective. It lacks the what is called the museum accounts or storytelling. There is no story to be recounted by this museum in order to reflect the identity, the history of the state. There are differences when it comes to the different contents or things that are displayed. So, for people to be able to know the history and the identity of the region, we're still hesitant and not have achieved much when it comes to those museums. We're still in our nursery slope steps. So, we still need to have experts from the region who would know those nuances that differentiate between the different countries in the GCC and what those communities wish to have. When it comes to the tools, are very attractive, particularly when it comes to the current generation. But if we pay heed to these tools and we lack what is called the essential value of museums, people would enter those museums without benefiting or learning anything. But when we have that essential value that is established in those museums, those tools, those technologies would attract those people to the roots, to the values, to the heritage that is presented and displayed in those museums. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sundus, for this valuable paper. In it, you told us about the history of museums in the Gulf states and the challenges they face, whether at the national or regional or even ideological challenges. Now we move to the second paper with Dr. Alanoud Al-Khalifa. And Dr. Alanoud is a researcher at the Gulf Studies Unit at the Arab Center. She holds a PhD from Qatar University, and she has won an award for outstanding research. Her research interests focus on contemporary issues and national identities in the Gulf states and the museum discourse in the Gulf countries. Her paper is titled Heritage and Global Expansion, Qatar National Museum's Discourse. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, first of all, I would like to welcome you all, and it gives me pleasure to present today on the Heritage and Global Expansion, Qatar National Museum's Discourse. The national museums provide platforms for understanding the dynamism of the past and the present and reflect the ideology of the state. His Highness Sheikh Tamim bin Hamed's inaugural speech at the opening of the National Museum reiterated the importance of museums as important institutions, and this is in line with the progressive line of thinking adopted by the state of Qatar and to represent the narrative and so far as the national identity of the state of Qatar is concerned. For this reason, the Qatar National Museum reflects the essence of contemporary Qatar. So, therefore, in this paper, I raise a number of questions. First of all, what role can the museum and through the museum, the legacy and the culture and heritage play in view of Qatar's expansion globally, and how can Qatar deal with the challenges resulting from the rapid development and expansion, and also how to explore the kind of narrative that the state of Qatar should promote through the museum as the national identity of Qatar. I have studied the narratives presented by the different exhibitions organized by the museum, especially the one on life in Qatar and the national fabric and the details of life, traditions, heritage, etc. And we have examined the last hall, which is called Qatar Today, to analyze the exhibits and to understand how these museums and their exhibits manifest the national identity. And the paper also discusses a different number of intricate issues and factors at visual, written, and other forms of exhibits, and to try to understand the basic functions of these sources and their symbolism through a multifaceted analysis to explore the different aspects of the discourse. I divided the paper into different themes. The first pertaining to the theoretical aspects, but like culture and heritage, and also to deal with the different aspects of it. The second theme explores the nature of culture and heritage in Qatar and the role this plays in formulating the national identity, and also the relationship between that and the policies of the country. And in the third part, I analyze the role of the museum in all of this, and finally some conclusions. I have only a few minutes. I will not go through all the details, but I'll shed some light on some ideas. When I examined the concepts of culture and legacy, I noticed there is a difference in the way the West views this and the way we in this region view it. And in in Qatar, the legacy or the heritage is considered part and parcel of life, everyday life, and this includes architecture, the tangible and intangible heritage and traditions, and it impacts the political policies and the interaction between different generations. Whereas, in comparison, in the West, this is only confined to a certain period in the past and some symbolism, and which gives the impression that the heritage in the West has ceased to exist some time ago, and the heritage and culture in our part of the world is still alive and is part of everyday life. This, of course, entails facing up to some challenges. The approach of the state takes this into consideration. Sheikh Al Mayasa, head of the museum's commission, says that we review our past and our present and try to link them both in a resilient manner, and Sheikh Mayas's speeches reflect Qatar's enthusiasm towards modernity and modernization and make it part of everyday life. And the Qatar National Vision 2030 also confirms this and tries to create a balance between keeping the traditions and looking forward to the future. And it's important also for us to understand the concepts coming from the West, which reflect consistency and stability, and take into account our own concepts and provide alternatives which can not be compatible with the Western models. And in fact, there are many studies showing that the the Western culture finds it difficult to deal with or accept certain aspects of our culture, and this, of course, is all in interaction with the continued everyday challenges. Culture is something which we notice everywhere. It's not constant, it's resilient, it's dynamic, and this is how culture is understood in this part of the world, and is not confined to the past or a certain period in history, but it grows and develops with generations, and each generation deals with it in its own way, and we try to analyze the concept from the point of view of the meaning and the significance from the point of view of the English and Arabic languages. I'll move now quickly to the museum and its role. As a result of the rapid developments in the 70s in the Gulf countries, including Qatar, there were many attempts which were made to protect the culture, and that included building museums. And national museums played an important role to symbolize national heritage and legacy, and therefore helped the people to form their national identity. And in the period of building states, it's important to have elements that link the individual with his past and his heritage. So the cultural identity focused on history and legacy and culture. A short time after independence in 1975, the National Museum was opened, which was the seat of government, which was built by Sheikh Abdulla bin Jassim, and it had some significance because it was the seat of government at the time when British hegemony was prevalent in the region, despite competition by the Ottomans, and they tried to reflect. The museum wanted to reflect the legitimacy of the ruling family, and that it has been here for uh, in the past and present, and also the other symbols reflecting the legitimacy of the ruling family. The National Museum focused on anthropology and archaeology, and it continued exhibiting the traditional ways of life. But in 1995, in the reign of His Highness Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa, Qatar started expressing its and exerting itself more, and the country started going through a transformation, and new institutions have been established to establish a new national identity and Qatar's influence in. This is what Hobson calls invention of inventing or starting new institutions, and Hobson also talks about the relationship between nationality and inventing culture, and the Sheikh Hamad era has been busy in establishing many institutions, employing a strategy to create a balance between economic expansion, utilizing of natural resources, and cultural projects. So, for this reason, 1996, the the National Museum of Qatar was closed in an attempt to rethink and re-establish it, and this has taken a long time until 2019, which was um, opened again. The old palace was kept as part of the museum, and the new design, the architecture of the National Museum was in the form of an orchid, which is a symbol of a desert rose, and, uh, and to instead of reinventing all traditions, it reflected the past, but also the country is thinking towards the future and reflected Qatar's progressive views and like Qatar's achievements and international achievements, which is an attempt by Qatar to go beyond the traditional culture or concept of culture, because it was not the only source of national identity, but Qatar sees itself now in a much bigger picture as its role it plays internationally and globally. So this distinction between national, regional, and international policies, and Qatar still supports that, but in a different direction. The approach of national identity is more of a global nature now, spread over a larger area, and culture and legacy is no longer used to enhance the citizen. Now, the country does not make citizens because citizenship is there, but moves the citizen to a global aspect, and through this narrative and through this National Museum is reflected to show that the national identity goes beyond only the legacy and culture, and it commits Qatar's global role and the how the international community views Qatar and its role and the dynamic nature and multifaceted nature of the national narrative in Qatar. So therefore, the museum tries to integrate this with the larger role on Qatar's global approach and also the citizens of Qatar when they inclusively integrate their efforts with the rest of the world. This is looked at as a way of forming the national identity and spreading its national narrative to use its soft power and expand its role through an enhanced look at its national identity as a responsible member of the international community and Qatar's investments abroad and participation globally. And the museum tries to present Qatar as a important player with an international or global mark which goes beyond oil and gas. I don't have time to go through the details of all the exhibits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alanoud. So we gave you 20 minutes, but you ended your presentation before the end of the time allocated. So you talked about the message of Qatar National Library Museum, sorry, and the role in reinforcing Qatari identity. We'd like to move to the third paper by Dr. Hai Won Jeong, who is a professor with us. She is an assistant professor in strategic studies at the National Defense College in the United Arab Emirates and in the International Relations Program within the Academic Programs Project of the military colleges at the Abu Dhabi University. Her research interests include foreign policy analysis, diplomatic studies, Middle East, Asia relations, and Gulf studies. Professor, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
First and foremost, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for hosting me for this very important event. It is a great honor and pleasure to be in Doha on this very special occasion. Today, I'm here to present my paper, which is titled UAE Innovates, and I'm looking at the case study of the Museum of the Future and nation branding in the age of technology and artificial intelligence. And so I'm looking at this case study on the Museum of the Future, and I'm approaching this topic from the lens of political science. So my background is in political science, and I do a lot of interdisciplinary research. And so I'm interested primarily in looking at how small states wield soft power and how they use cultural tools and resources to that end. And I'm also interested in exploring the question, how do small states punch above its weight? And so with that in mind, the research question that I seek to address in my paper is, how is innovation strategy or the broader ecology of, or the broader ecosystem of innovation shaping, how is that shaping nation branding practices in small states? And given my background in area studies, and particularly I'm interested in looking at this question in the context of the GCC states. And so in the literature, smallness of a state is defined in terms of size of the population, geographic size. It's also defined in terms of having a relatively limited economic base and also having a limited strategic depth in military terms. And as scholars such as Alan Jeong argues, the ability to wield soft power is a vital leverage for small states, given that it virtually enlarges the diplomatic space and it also enhances the diplomatic capabilities of a small state. And so considering that the UAE is both a small state and also a young nation state, my paper sort of explores the premise that the UAE has been leveraging innovation strategy as a soft power enabler. And so the question, why UAE as a case study? And I'm looking at the Museum of the Future in Dubai as a case study, primarily due to access. I've been based in Abu Dhabi for many years now. And aside from my personal interest, it's also based upon the UAE's performance in global indexes. And this includes the Global Innovation Index, where it is identified as the second most innovative economies in West Asia and North Africa. And it's also based upon its performances in Brand Finance's Global Soft Power Index, as well as the Nation Brands Index. And so given these data, I'm using the Museum of the Future as a case study, and my paper explores the intersection of culture and the broader ecosystem of innovation through the prism or through the lens of a technology museum. And so by looking at the Museum of the Future as a case study, I'll try to give you a little bit of context and background on the museum itself. The museum was founded by the Dubai Future Foundation in February 2022. And basically, the museum itself bears the imprint of the vision and mission statement of the Dubai Future Foundation, which is very much focused on the idea of imagining, inspiring, and designing the future. So it is highly futuristic, future-oriented. It's very big on future forecasting. And so Technology Museum in this context is understood both as a tourist attraction as well as a place of informal learning. And technology in my paper, whether it has to do with AI technology or technology more broadly in broader terms, is regarded as both as a tool and a medium of communication, as well as a museum object, an object of display. And so the museum, because it looks to the future, it's very focused on projecting the future, specifically in the year 2071. It's very rich in sensory stimuli. It's highly interactive. It features AI-powered audio and videos. It also displays robots because it's focused on technology and innovation. It uses both human guides as well as audio guides, and it uses a lot of projections in many of its exhibits. And so both the human guide and audio guide takes the visitors on a futuristic tour to the year 2071. And so even starting from the elevator is designed in the form and shape of a space shuttle. And so it takes the visitors on a tour to the future, to the year 2071. And it's the fifth floor. It takes the visitors up to the fifth floor. And the exhibit on the 5th floor is named OSS Hope, and it's focused on a space travel theme. And from there onwards, they basically suggest the idea that the outer space is very rich in minerals and alternative resources, and they kind of link that to the idea of sustainability for the future. And the exhibits are organized and structured on a floor-by-floor basis, and it takes the visitors down to the 4th floor. And the exhibit is on Heal Institute. On the 4th floor, the exhibit focuses on the theme of ecological preservation and biodiversity, promoting biodiversity of the future. It features a massive DNA library of different species, and it also projects a plasma screen where it discusses or explores the idea of repairing the Amazon rainforest in the foreseeable future. And this takes us to the exhibit on the 3rd floor, which is titled Al-Waha, and it has an oasis theme. It's mainly focused on therapy and meditation. It has a new age ambiance to it. It uses a lot of audio and visual stimuli to engage the visitors. And this also takes us to the 2nd floor, and the theme for the 2nd floor is mainly focused on the title Tomorrow Today. And this exhibit is mainly focused on displaying technology, cutting-edge technology. It displays robots. It focuses mainly on the theme of climate change and sustainability, as well as waste management practices. So again, it's highly centered on the theme of sustainability. And the last exhibit that they have is on the 1st floor. It's called Future Heroes, and they have a children's section for this. And they prepare a lot of interactive activities for children, and they foster the idea of collaboration and creativity for children. In terms of the theoretical framework that I used for my paper, I've looked at Simon Anholt's nation brand theory. And Simon Anholt is a former board member of the UK Public Diplomacy Committee. And he's also an inaugural editor for the Place Branding and Public Diplomacy Journal. Currently, he serves as an independent policy advisor to many of the governments on issues of nation branding. And according to Simon Anholt, nation brand is primarily about good brand management practices. And in terms of maintaining good brand management practices, this entails introducing, correcting, targeting, or improving a nation brand. And so when we say that we're introducing a nation brand, it means that you are introducing a nation brand for the very first time when it has limited reputation. And when we say that we're correcting a nation brand, it means that there is a level of engagement and there is a level of national reputation. However, the nation is actually known for the wrong reasons. And when we say that we're targeting a nation brand, it means that we need to specify the target audience to enhance nation branding strategy. And when we say that we're improving a nation brand, it means that even though a nation has a level of reputation, it suffers from negative image, and therefore it has to rectify this issue. And so within this context, I argue that the UAE is seeking to correct the image as a young petrostate. So it's trying to project an image that goes beyond the conception or the notion that the UAE is a young petrostate. And alongside, so as part of Anholt's nation brand theory, he also has a nation brand hexagon, which consists of 6 dimensions. And this includes governance, exports, tourism, investment and immigration, culture and heritage, and people. And so within the nation brand hexagon, I specifically focus on one dimension, which is on culture and heritage. But according to Simon Anholt, nation brand consists of all 6 dimensions in the hexagon, rather than focusing on one specific pillar or dimension. And so I argue in my paper that I'm looking at the notion of nation branding strategies rather than a nation brand, which looks at the totality of all 6 dimensions in harmony. And but at the same time, even though I focus on the culture and heritage dimension in my paper, I would also argue that the labeling is also somewhat misleading, because even though I do focus on the cultural sector in my paper as a case study, my paper does not directly deal with cultural heritage per se, because it looks at Science and Technology Museum, and it does not specifically deal with national museums that displays cultural heritage as the main object of display. And in terms of some of my key arguments, I basically argue in my paper that Technology Museum is a vehicle and an avenue for projecting the futuristic vision of a state. And as I alluded to earlier, my paper has a different focus, because national museums tend to propagate a nation building narrative that focuses on cultural heritage. And so instead of looking at how museums seek to revitalize the notion of cultural authenticity, I shift the focus from nation building to nation branding, whereby the museum focuses on propagating and disseminating a futuristic narrative based on imagination. And so the main focus here is to look to the future, to project ahead to the future, to the year 2071, rather than looking to the past. And it is not by accident that the museum has decided to focus on the year 2071. It's very much linked to the idea of Centennial 2071, which marks the 100th anniversary since the founding of the UAE as a modern nation state. And so it has a highly futuristic focus, and the narrative is built upon imagination, imagining, construing, looking ahead, and projecting the future vision. In terms of my methodology, I use thematic analysis as my methodology. And within thematic analysis, there are broadly 2 types. One is semantic thematic analysis, and the other type is called constructionist thematic analysis. And my paper specifically focuses on the constructionist track, because I believe that narratives are based upon social construction. And particularly in this context, it is very much so, because the futuristic narrative is based on imagination rather than being based upon tangible objects or based on the reality that you see in a physical sense. So instead of focusing on the visible, tangible aspects of reality, the narrative is very much based on imagination. It fosters creativity. And so, yes, I'll quickly move on to conclusion and I'll end my presentation. And so I basically, just to conclude, I argue in my paper that the cultural sector seeks to ascertain or cement the UAE's national image as a modern nation state. So the emphasis tends to be on modernization of the state beyond the image of a young nation state or the image of a petro state. And I also argue in my paper that by looking at a technology museum as a case study, this is very much tied to national strategies, national vision, which includes the UA Centennial 2071, as well as National Innovation Strategy, which was launched back in 2014. But of course, in the last 2 years, there has also been an increasing focus on the impact of artificial intelligence as well. And so, yes, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Haiwan. She presented on building national identity in the age of digitization and the UAE's ambitions in this regard through building museums. Now we open the floor for your questions. Please make your question direct and pointed and state to whom you are addressing the question so that we can allow as many questions. We'll take a round of questions, then we will give the chance. In the name of God, the most merciful, my name is Jassim Al-Ghayth. My question to Sundus, Al-Rashid, and Dr. Alanoud. Dr. Sundus, why why seem to be embarrassed by colonization? This is a reality, and we are here to speak candidly. And also, what are the archaeological studies outside the scope of museums? The West adopted the Greek civilizations. As for the pharaohs and others, were only as a source for research, but for the Greek civilization, the West sees itself an extension of that. Dr. Al-Anud, you said the state does not make citizens. It's as if you are telling us that this culture is there, it's done, it's stable, and we can benefit from other cultures. I beg to disagree because the national culture and the citizens' culture always requires keeping an eye on it and creating balances and shifts, etc. Thank you. I have a quick question to each of the ladies. Dr. Sundus, I liked very much your paper, especially the political part of it for the formation of museums. And there is another ideological, political problem. Do you think the museums turned the works of art from their natural habitat and turn them into commodities or even add some sort of a sacred nature to them. Dr. Alanoud, I was really impressed I thought it can be boring, but it is very dynamic, it's very informative, and this is a very impressive museum indeed you have. But you talked about the invention and moving towards the future and that the state does not create citizens, but it opens international doors and a global role for them. Museums, by and large, now have a futuristic look. Do you have any fears? In Kuwait, we always have a fear that, for example, we lost some traditional buildings because of modernization. We lost Al-Barkiya building recently. Doctor.
For the paper, what do you think of the presence of yeah. So what do you think, how do you read the presence of the branch of the Louvre in Abu Dhabi? I mean, you've talked about a futuristic museum within the young nation, but actually importing a branch, how do you read that within Abu Dhabi? Is that also another jump to the future, or how do you read that? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is to Dr. Sundus regarding to the fact that she said Kuwait has been relatively late when compared the museums of Kuwait to the museums in Qatar and the Emirates. Why did we stay behind? Is it lack of vision, lack of financial resources, or is it a bit of both? The other question, you did not talk about private museums. They are available in Kuwait, and some have very rare collections. Some are Kuwaiti, some Arab, some international. I think these personal or private collections, even if they are to be open to the public, they may compensate for the lack of museums that you talked about. My name is Ismi Azraq. I'm from Al-Arabi Television. I have a program on museums which will be launched at the beginning of the year. I read that in the Gulf countries there is something like a syndrome in the Gulf countries, which is almost an obsession, that turning everything into a museum. To all three of them. Cengiz Tomar from Istanbul. First of all, we thank Dr. Sundus. In the beginning, she said museums started in the West, but in the 19th century there was an exception. In 1846, the Humayun museum was established in Istanbul, which is the oldest. And also, what's the role of museums in forming the nation state? Assalamu alaikum. Thank you to all three ladies. My question is to Dr. Sundus. I agree with you that museums are a Western idea, but I beg to differ with you on that there is Western control over what is exhibited in them. We in the Gulf countries, we do not have experts, or maybe we lack the proper qualified people, maybe, but we imported many things from the West, but the positive aspect about the museums, but the museums have a political role and an educational role and economic role. But Gulf countries, when they started building museums, they did not have an economic vision behind it. What's your comment on that? Harf Hassan from Suali.
Hi, Jeong. I had a chance to visit the Museum of Future in Dubai and also Museum of Future in Berlin. And comparing the two, I noticed that the Museum of Future in Berlin gave much larger space for governance and social and political issues, such as the future of democracy, climate change, class relations, the house of the future, the room of the future, things like that. And I noticed that Museum of Future in Dubai did not have that space for issues of governance and social and political issues. Do you think this is part of the strategies to conceal the political and social and focus on technology, or is an outcome of a reductionist perception of future, that the future is about technology only? Thank you.
Yeah. We can't hear the chairperson without using a microphone. Thank you, Dr. Aisha. I thank Dr. Sundus for her wonderful paper and her approach. I have a question, direct question. The impact of the West and the manifestations of that you did not focus on. And how do these museums reflect or manifest the history of the country, or mainly it draws from the larger civilization, the Islamic civilization, and we have a museum which was opened in March this year in Oman. Thank you to all of you for this. This is one of the best sessions so far. And we talked about Dr. Alanoud and Dr. Sundus to maybe prepare a book on this subject. I have comments from a theoretical point of view. I think the theoretical contextualization for studying museums is important, and in Iraq, the National Museum was opened by the British in 1922. The papers which require more digging into this, what are the other functions? I think what Dr. Alanoud has raised the point about is it that the museums, apart from the political aspirations that Dr. Hai talked about, their role was in, in Iraq. The National Museum wanted to separate Iraq's history from the Sassanids, the Ottomans, the others. And the Museum of Islamic Art wants to break barriers, to say I'm part of all these civilizations. Even the Oman National Museum's function is clear for evident for everyone to see, but the Arab Art Museum was is saying to us that this is not, and we are part of this legacy, and apart from, I think, studying the museums in Gulf countries will give us an insight into how this particular part of our lives is reflected. Thank you, and to all presenters. I have a question to Dr. Sundus. You mentioned in your paper that in the museums in the West that they control even what we exhibit in our museums. This is not very clear to me. How can they manage that? I have a question to whoever can answer. In Andalusia, in Spain, there is an exhibition on the Inquisitions. What is the philosophy of that exhibition? I think we took enough questions. We'll ask dear colleagues. You have 3 minutes. It's not necessary to respond to every single person. Thank you for your questions. There are many questions about the idea of the West and West's interference in museums. When I mentioned how they had an influence on the exhibits and especially the cultural path, they do that through the experts, because museums were established through consultation with Western experts. In Kuwait, UNESCO and the International Council for Museums prepared a list for all sections and rooms and what will be exhibited in it. So this is a simple example. If we were talking about other forms of hegemony, even our culture and legacy, everything is done through the recognition of by the UNESCO, the cedar, palm trees, and it's not called culture until the UNESCO recognizes it. So this is another form of hegemony. As for the works of art, yes, it's true that they are turned into commodities. I don't find that in museums as much as I see that in public spaces when we see big screens and to show them. Also, the part of the objectives behind starting museums to be quiet places for reflection and for human beings to go back to some reflection and thinking. of course, works of art add value to museums, but now there is a lot of consumerism in our societies in the world. This has pushed museums to think about the economics that they have edutainments. This is like a commodity. It is offered. They are not commercial places, but this is the commodity provided in museums. As for private museums, yes, they do cover and fill gaps that the national museums do not. In Kuwait, we have people who have collections which can be more valuable than the collections in the national museums. And we have the Islamic collection, which is on permanent loan to the government. Thank you for what you said about Istanbul. Sources differ on that, but about the history of the first museum in the world. Museums play many roles. Maybe in the beginning of museums, they were meant to be forming the national identity and the creation of citizens, etc. But now it has expanded, the role has expanded to discuss issues relating to society, and they play an educational role. But what happened is our museums are lagging behind, and the Arab societies in the past, it was important for people to visit museums, and it was part of the curricula. But now we visit a museum for once only. When a museum is opened and there's a lot of publicity, we go and visit it, and then we forget about it. As for the education and entertainment side, we mentioned that museums do really present history of the country, but as we said, this is influenced by Western experts. And for nation building, and these are ideas that we still are adhering to that and think that museums' role is focused on that, but in fact the role of museums has expanded a great deal. In Belgium, there was a study which that like when you have things like you feel some stress, you are prescribed to visit a museum, and it will make you feel better. Museums differ from national museums, have their own philosophy to tell the national narrative. There are political museums on slavery, for example. They have political objectives. Their philosophy is different, but they still have a political element. The educational museums, of course, aim towards covering the needs of children for education. It depends on the sponsors and the financiers who. There was a question about the archaeological studies. I do not feel embarrassed at all by mentioning colonialism. We do really have a problem, and I call it a problem because we have submitted to it without looking at it, and has to adapt it to the needs of our society. Most archaeological missions are done through Western experts. We have Kuwaiti experts, but maybe they remain in the shadows more. We hear that when Western archaeologists come, a Kuwaiti archaeologist may accompany them, but we still lack in that. Why? Because we still glorify what comes from the West. Thank you. And why museums in Kuwait are still lagging behind? I think they are not looked at as a priority, and what role museums can play in society is not considered a priority.
So perhaps making citizens has created perhaps an issue in the meaning. So the museum, when it was first inaugurated or established, it was a means whereby we build a state to have an identity, to link citizens with their heritage, and to promote this national identity. Yes, now we have an existing national identity. The state of Qatar, through its transformative vision that it aims to achieve, it understands that it has an identity, but the aim now is to transfer this identity. So, what I would like to talk about is the narrative that is promoted by the museum. So, this is the sought narrative that they aim to uh, disseminate through the museum. So they want to re-establish new tactics of citizenship. So they want it to be part of the global platform. So the state is preparing citizens for such an end. So, in addition to that, it is important from the museum's account or narrative. This does not mean that our heritage is no longer important. So, in the last hall, we have used many tools such as the multiplicity of culture or the diversity in terms of culture, humanitarian aid, and so on. So, speeches delivered by His Highness the Emir. So, these were the accounts or narratives that have been used by the museum. So, building a cultural heritage is a bit complex because we have many narratives inside the museum and outside the museum. So we have the ambition and the future, heritage and also traditions, and also cultural diplomacy, because we use these kind of narratives for many objectives. So these exist inside and outside the museum. With regard to the question that you pose, if I understood you well, talking about the museum for many years, the GCC countries have been promoted as being similar to each other. So when we used to visit national museums, we used to look at the souvenirs that we can collect, and we found out that these souvenirs were all similar to each other. The state of Qatar wants to distinguish itself from others, to say that we are different. And this was part of the narrative that was promoted by the museum. The state of Qatar, the designer, thought about this. Of course, in keeping with those in charge of the museum, they thought about coming up with new symbols of such identity. So we thought about the guhuf, or the flower desert, or the desert flower. So it is called the guhuf in the local dialects. So this is a new kind of symbol that was announced and is part of the national museum. This would give it more importance as a symbol. So the process was the process of producing a new symbol for the state instead of coming up with something that already exists and try to reinvent it. Of course, this also underlines the image of the state of Qatar as a state moving towards the future. I hope I was able to answer your question.
Thank you very much for the questions. I'll go back to the first question that was being asked about Louvre. I would say that in the case of Louvre, I think there is more emphasis on cultural globalization, more so than the need for projecting a futuristic vision towards the future. And of course, if you look at the literature itself, there is a great discussion about franchise museums being as a form of a franchise. And so the message that I'm getting from Louvre is that the UAE is keen on promoting cultural globalization for the purpose of enhancing its nation branding strategy. And also this is emblematic of, it embodies the principle of cultural diplomacy. So I see it more through that lens. And to answer the gentleman's question at the back with regards to the Museum of the Future in Berlin and the Museum of the Future in Dubai, I would actually say that, first of all, if you look at the Gulf Studies literature as a whole, there is a discussion about different sectors of globalization, be it cultural globalization, economic globalization or political globalization. And the literature does actually make the point, I think Christian Ulrichsen also wrote about this before, that the GCC states are regulating how they choose to participate in each of these sectors. So I would actually frame or preface my answer based on that literature. And I would say that that the GCC states as a whole, and this is not confined to the UAE specifically, are free to regulate how they choose to participate in the globalization process as a sovereign nation state. And I would also argue that adopting technology is definitely not all that there is to embracing innovation. However, it is still a good place to start as an enabler, because as I mentioned earlier, museums are conceptualized as an informal learning space. And so it does actually communicate the will of the state to promote that kind of mindset. It's not all that there is. There should be other elements and enablers that should be promoted on the side, but it's still a good place to begin. And I would end by arguing that also I think it's also nice to look at museums from a comparative lens to an extent. It does give us an eye-opening perspective. However, in this case, I think it's wrong to compare apples with oranges. I think the GCC states and Germany are fundamentally different in so many regards. And so I think each country has its own right to project its own brand image and its own narrative. And so that's how I would frame it. Thank you.
أرى الموضوع. شكرا جزيلا. I would like to thank you very much for this very, very important session. I would like to thank the different speakers, Dr. Sundus Al-Rashid, Dr. Alanoud, Dr. Hai Won Jeong. Thank you very much.